cannabis activist, educator, and researcher, and I am joined by my co-host, Uncle Dig, who is out of Oregon and is a cannabis activist and a cannabis podcaster. How you doing today, Uncle Dig?
Hey, I'm doing great, Lucas. How about you?
Man, I'm doing good, and we were just talking before the show how great it is this time of year in the Northwest, that we're starting to come out of this crazy rainy season that everybody always talks about. Everywhere you go around the country, oh, you're from Seattle, oh, it rains a lot there. Well, it doesn't necessarily rain a lot, but it's really cloudy a lot. But we're getting that sunshine, and that's some good news.
Oh, yeah, and that sunshine and those lengthening days mean that it's time to get your photo periods ready to go outside.
Yeah, and that is what we're going to be talking about right at first, because hopefully if you're growing cannabis in one of the states that has legal cannabis, or you're a medical cannabis patient and you have the place to do it and you're following all the regulations, that you have your seeds ready to go and your plants, I'd say seeds should have been going for about a month now, but it's not too late to get those seeds in the ground now, is it, Dig? In the Northwest, at least.
No, and I've started seeds around this time, around May 15th, and have not gone, had really established plants until in the middle of June and put them in their final things, and I've still had very respectable harvests from those plants. But we are getting into your last chance territory. So if you're wanting to grow outdoors, at least out here in the Northwest, I think I'm in 8B. I don't know what gardening zone you were in, but it's time. It's time to get out there if you want to get those respectable yields.
Yeah, because those things are going to start flowering right about the beginning of August, around the 15th of August, I've sort of calculated, and they will start producing the flowers, which we also call as buds. So you want to have a good 2 months or so before that happens, that the roots gets nice and established. And also the dry months over the summer can wreak havoc on a cannabis plant if you don't keep them really watered, because they're pretty delicate plants the way they're constructed.
Yeah, they have a lot of responsive. They're really responsive to having too much or not enough water in the soil. You really want to water cannabis to saturation levels and then let it suck all the water out and let it dry out the soil almost completely, which is counterintuitive to some other crops. But cannabis, when it runs out of water, it'll just almost fall over in a matter of a couple hours. Whereas if it gets overwatered, the leaves will droop and it'll almost gain this appearance of like a weeping willow, and it'll look really sad. And some people erroneously will think, oh no, it doesn't have enough water, but in fact it's got too much water. So watering, depending on your medium, can be some of the most challenging things this time of year, because your root ball really hasn't filled your container yet. So there's a lot of dead water that you have to let evaporate before you add it more.
Yeah, you have to be really careful. You just need to make sure that you're going to have enough uptake of water that will fit how much you're watering it. So like you said, make sure that you're just not overwatering it, especially right at first when they're little, because you could kill them off, and I've killed off more than one plant like that. So it's kind of easy to do, so be real careful out there. But if you haven't already, go ahead and get your seeds in the ground. And speaking of getting our seeds in the ground, we are going to get into our first story, and this story is out of Massachusetts, and I wrote a story on this over at ganjapreneurs.com. And this story is about Massachusetts is actually opening up 73,000 acres of protected farmland to hemp and cannabis growing. But it's not what you think, Dig. It's not what people think, where it's like a environmentally saved preservation project or something. They're all of a sudden going to start growing cannabis and hemp on it. Tell us a little bit about the program, what they're going to be doing.
No, and this is one of those fun, social engineering things that some governments do. So what this is this basically, this is an overgeneralization, but basically this is deed restrictions that landowners sign that limit the types of agricultural they'll do on land. A lot of times they're agreements to leave fields fallow, or to dedicate part of it to wildland so they don't deplete these farming soils that are preserved for the future. And they're now opening up these preserved farmlands to cannabis cultivation. So before this land was fallow, but it was never a nature preserve. It was always intended to eventually be used for agriculture.
Yeah, it's just the way they had the laws written with the legal cannabis laws and the hemp laws. They were, and because but some of these still will be restricted if they're under federal programs. So it was just the way they had the law written, and I'm sure some farmers complained. But all these looks like will be outdoors. It looks like to me, and that's actually our guest is going to be on later. Going to be talking about the energy consumption of indoor cannabis compared to outdoor cannabis. So that is what's going on in Massachusetts. They're really kind of opening this up for the farmers, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think it's good that we're looking at areas where we can cultivate outdoors. Cultivating outdoors, I think, is better in the long run for the environment, and I think it's also better just in general for normalization of the plant. So I think that's the way we should ultimately be headed. Now, indoor is always going to have a place in certain climates and for hobby growing, but on a large scale, that shouldn't be the way we're focusing.
Yeah, and we will have on Dr. Evan Mills later to talk about that. And he actually gave this speech that we're going to be hearing at the Washington State Sun Growers Association, their outdoor cannabis cup. So it's a really good talk. And be sure to check in on the links. We don't really usually put links to websites and whatnot on our show description, but pay attention this time. We will have Dr. Evan Mills' PowerPoint, and he is a energy / climate scientist out of Berkeley, I believe, somewhere in California. So he has been doing this for a long time, so it will be great to be hearing from him later on the show. Now we're going to be moving on to our next story, and this is a story that's kind of been in the news in a different context. I'm sure some people have heard about the new thing where they're saying from the census, a lot of states in the Northeast, in the Midwest, are losing a lot of population, and other so-called conservative states or other states around the country are gaining population. One of the things they found by looking at this is with some of the recreational states. There's 17. It's hard to believe, Dig. There's 17 recreational states plus D.C. Those states are gaining population, although it's a little confusing. The population in general is slowing down.
Yes. So it seems like what the data seems to suggest is that people seem to be moving to states where recreational cannabis is legal, i.e., emigrating with an E, not an I. Immigrating, I with an I, going to those states from other states. But also something to keep in mind is while these markets are growing, they're growing at the slowest rates since the Depression. This has been one of the lowest growth decades since the 1930s.
Yeah, and that kind of makes sense because of the civil unrest and everything that's been going on for so long. And another thing about this census, there's really no telling if it actually was a 100% successful census, because they had a really lot of problems with the thing. So I think these numbers are good, but maybe want to watch out for them.
I don't actually trust the all the numbers from the current census. I think that, like many things recently, the Republicans pursued this census with not the purest motives, or I think they probably cheated or rigged it a little bit. I don't know. But that's just my suspicion, judged based on how the Republicans have gerrymandered things in the past and how they've operated during the last 4 or 5 years. I just really don't trust anything they do or say.
Yeah, and they might have not cheated like, oh, we're going to cheat, but I think sometimes bungling something on purpose might be cheating as well. So I think that they could have been rigging the numbers, but they also could have sort of bungled it because they had the whole big delay and everything. So it is fascinating that these states that are recreational cannabis are growing, but it's not really something that's going to be. And we don't know if people are moving there because of the recreational cannabis either. So that's another thing to kind of think about. But if I was. And they're saying a lot of people are moving down south, which there's no recreational cannabis down south as far as I know. So they are opening up medical cannabis down there. But just some interesting data to take a look at and think about. But most of all the West is recreational, and a lot of people are moving out west too.
Yeah. With the exception of California. I think California is seeing a net decline.
All right, so next up we're going to get in, speaking of the West, we're going to get into our next story, which is about Vegas cannabis consumption lounges. And for those of you who don't know, this is the idea of kind of opening up like a cannabis bar type place where you can go and actually socialize and use cannabis, which I really wish they would bring that to Washington, but there's not even any talk about it because for some reason it's just something so bizarre. I don't understand why it is, because I've been in places where like 40 or 50 people at gatherings or whatnot, and everybody there is using cannabis. So I'm not sure why having like a business that's a cannabis social club is so controversial, Dig.
People don't like to, certain kinds of people don't like to be around it or be able to see it at all. They like to pretend like it doesn't exist. It's better for their fragile little brains if they don't ever see anyone smoke anything. I personally believe that cannabis consumption lounges are cool. They're neat. I think they're a way to extract more money from cannabis patients and customers than they were already going to spend. I personally believe, and I think that this is what we should be advocating for, that at a bare minimum, you should be able to smoke weed wherever you can smoke a cigarette. Period.
Yeah, and I think some states are like that. I know it's not like that here, but some states are like that. But one of the interesting things I saw about the Vegas cannabis consumption lounges, and I think is really cool, and it might actually get me to go to Vegas, would be they are going to have like places where you can go and watch them doing certain types of cannabis manufacturing processes, which would be like having people behind like a screen or something where you can see them work on all
like
the flour.
Cheese. Like there's a place down the road from me that does artisan cheese, and there's windows where you can watch them make cheese while you eat their cheese.
Yep, that's how these cannabis consumption lounges looks like they're going to be
Honestly,
in Vegas.
That does sound really fun, like a jelly bean factory tour or like a winery or something. That's rad.
It is really nice that they're going to be doing it because, like you were just saying, some people don't want to see it. Some people have never seen it. So you might get people come through there that might not even be cannabis consumers, but they want to come through and kind of check out what is going on with all the processes, because it is still a lot of this stuff like BHO and how they do the bubble hashes and all these different things. It is a mystery. And I didn't learn about it until some of these things until recently too myself. So it would be cool to go check them out.
Because that would be almost like a vacation event in itself. Like let's take grandma and show her how weed is made and let her make up her own mind. You know, because some people don't want to eat or smoke or ingest or interact with anything that they don't know how it was made. And I think there's a lot of unnecessary mystery in growing cannabis and preparing cannabis to smoke or to cook with cannabis to make edibles. And I think that mystery needs to go away, because when we get rid of the mystery, we get rid of the stigma. People can actually come and interact with the plant on their own terms, not on other people's terms. And I think that's important.
Yeah, and that's going to get us good segue right into our next story, which is people interacting with the cannabis plant, not by their ears and not by their lungs. And I don't know about your ears, maybe hearing the wind rustle through the leaves, I guess, but the people's smell. And it's a story that we keep hearing over and over again, how one of the biggest complaints about the new cannabis legalization movement is the smell. And I have to tell you, the other day, a friend of mine took me over to a store to get some cannabis. It's the first time I had ever been there, and so we kind of went a different route in Tacoma than I had been before. And we were driving down the road, and over here in South Tacoma, it's some kind of valley. I can't remember what they call it. But the whole place was smelling like cannabis. Now, to me, that smells way better than like a sewer plant or a burning car. It doesn't bother me at all. But apparently, to some people, the smell is just beyond the pale. They can't take it.
And I would tell those people to move, maybe to Texas. So the thing about the smell complaint. People in Tacoma don't have any room to complain about smells. The way your harbor smells sometimes and the different aromas you get in Tacoma, no one should be complaining about a natural plant smell in Tacoma. But I would caution people that when they hear this argument, I think it's it's kind of a false flag, right? This is like a homeowners association, or like these people we call Karens, right? They're coming up with a reason to interfere in your life.
It's just something new that they haven't encountered, they come across, and it really bothers them. And they have to point it out. Yeah.
In a couple years, you won't even notice that smell. And you know what? If you do, maybe you should look for someplace else to live. Because if you live in a state that's free and allowing people to grow cannabis and you don't like freedom, well, maybe you should move to somewhere with like-minded individuals.
Yeah, I agree. Because the government and everybody else lets these polluters just totally destroy our environment. I remember right before I left Alabama, I went down to the river and just seeing like a haze of chlorine across it and smelling of dead algae and all this dead fish or whatnot.
Look at the entire Gulf.
The Gulf
Coast. Look at what the oil companies have done to the Gulf.
Yeah,
it's nasty. It's nasty. It's horrible.
Yes, and it's all done under the guise of some type of regulation, but they write the regulations so that people can't pollute.
And they say, if you don't love it, leave it. Well, I throw that right back at them.
Yeah, for some reason now we have the plants. They're all worried about that. Plants, which is, it can be a little strong, but I mean, I've been around really strong cannabis smelling warehouses and whatnot, and it's just not that bad. There's no burning sensation. Your eyes don't water. It's not. It's just
the article
it's a
makes
Karen.
Some false claims too about the smell. The article claims that the smell of fresh cannabis growing never goes away, which is false.
The wind comes through, it goes away. Yes.
Yeah. You don't grow in a place. After a couple months, you won't be able to smell cannabis anymore. And grows don't smell all the time. They only smell when the cannabis is flowering. And if you don't like the smell of cannabis, you should be proposing for outdoor growing, because then outdoor growing with photoperiod plants, you're only going to have to smell that once, maybe twice a year.
Yeah, and on the indoors, they do have scrubbers, but it's just such a big, massive smell if you get all those plants in smelling it. And it, like I said, to me, and I'm not very empathetic on this, like I said, because I used to stand by the bus and have to wait on the bus, and people were coming by in their cars and choking me down with carbon monoxide every morning. I mean, so it's like, come on, folks, we all kind of have to live with each other. Let's stop trying to shut down a cannabis plant or legalization because you have a problem with the smell. It's way down on the list of problems, I believe.
You get more with sugar than with salt too. So if you've got a neighbor who likes to grow a particular pungent skunk variety, maybe instead of sicking the cops on them or causing a fuss with the HOA or whatever, maybe you go over and just ask them, hey, is there something that smells a little more floral, or can you add a carbon filter to that indoor grow for me? I'd appreciate it. I don't particularly like the smell. And if you go to him like that, there might be a solution you can find, because not all cannabis smells good. There are cannabis strains out there. I mean, do you remember cat piss?
Yep, I heard about that. Yep.
Yeah, it smells like a litter box. It's not a good smell, but it was potent weed that produced well, so people kept growing it for a while.
Yeah, I heard about that one. So speaking of outdoor growing, we are going to get into our guest today, and he will be introduced by Jeremy Moberg of the Cannabis Sun Growers Association, and we will be hearing from Dr. Evan Mills, and Jeremy will introduce all his qualifications. So let's hear from Dr. Evan Mills real quick on the benefits of growing outdoor cannabis.
I wanted Dr. Evan Mills as our keynote speaker because it really is so important to understand the scientific basis behind the sustainability issues in cannabis. And here, 4 years later, we finally get the opportunity to get Dr. Evan Mills here. And so it's with great honor that I introduce a real personal hero to me, Dr. Evan Mills. Thank you, Dr. Evan Mills, for taking your time to speak to such an important issue and to continuing to do it without getting paid, really just taking this on as something that you knew needed to be done, where we can really make true change and true impact through education. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Evan Mills.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you so much for that really nice introduction, and Crystal as well, and for all your efforts to create your association. That history was really interesting. Jeremy, that's a great kind of segue, into this. I guess first of all, here we are on Earth Day, and it is a bizarre juxtaposition now of Earth Day and Weed Day, just 2 days apart, or Earth Week and Weed Week, whatever. And that's, you're all very aware of that. Jeremy was very eloquent in starting to explain why that is. So meanwhile, I'm bringing coals to Newcastle. I'm here to talk to you guys who are, you are the hub of an incredibly important and potent climate solution. The slides you're about to see will kind of put that into kind of sharper focus for you, but you are what it's all about. You are exemplifying that we don't have to trade off lifestyle or quality of life or recreation or medicine for the climate. We do trade them off if we grow indoors, but that's not a necessary thing. And this is a much broader, important message that we don't have to have colder houses in winter and warmer, overheated houses in summer, and so on and so forth. We can have our lifestyles and also be climate friendly if we're conscious about it. So my aim in the next few minutes is to just help illustrate the specific reasons that sun-grown is not just the best, but it's really the only sustainable way to grow cannabis. And so I'll just kind of jump into it, but be proud of what you do. And for those of you who cultivate indoors, thank you for being here, for listening, for obviously having an open mind. It's full of nuance. This isn't a topic to oversimplify. There's a lot of reasons indoor happens, but let's go forward. So do you want to see, I'm going to share my screen. Is that what I'm doing? Or are we already good, Crystal, with that process?
Yeah, you should need to share your screen.
Okay, so, and then I'm going to pick, I don't know, there's the keynote. I'm going to share, and then I'm going to go into present, play mode, and we should have a nice full screen of words and pictures.
Looks good.
Okay. Looks good. So Earth Day and Weed Day are an odd couple. I did just post yesterday a piece on Medium that you can get to through my website in the lower left with the same title. Just kind of summarizes what I'm going to say here today to you all. And you'll notice I used a picture of one of your favorite members there who needs no introduction. There's Jeremy on the left, and there's a 55-acre proposed indoor grow on the right, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Last month I had a piece in Slate that was kind of a complimentary piece that started to kind of unpack and debunk some of these kind of urban myths about why indoor is superior. And feel free to take a look at that too. These are all, you can find these from my website or just from Googling around. So here's a picture I found just a week or so ago. It's the perfect picture today because this is, part of the broader backdrop, right, is that your customers, your consumers, and all the intermediaries are largely living in a climate denial, even today, and much less than before. But it's still the backdrop problem is, is climate change really happening? Is it caused by humans? But most importantly, at this point, most people believe that, or know that. I shouldn't say believe, but know it factually. But then what can I do? So most people see it's the factories, it's the trains, it's the airplanes. They don't really think about their own consumption choices when in fact they are a very large slice of the overall human carbon pie. So anyway, this is a fire in it's called the Eagle Creek Fire a few years ago, 30,000 acre fire just across the river from this golf course in Washington State. So here's your own state. Everybody's out there playing golf while this 30,000 acre wildfire rages. First, I thought this was maybe one of those fake photos, but this was in CNN. This is a real thing that happened. And then you'll see the gentleman with his head in the ground in the lower left, and we'll come back to him a little bit later. So many of you may have seen this piece. This was in the paper that Jeremy mentioned that I published, first a white paper in 2010 or 11, and then in an academic journal in 2012, and just breaking down like how much energy is used for indoor, where does it go, what's the carbon footprint. So we get about indoor cannabis being on average, big range, or mileage may vary, 4,600 times its weight in CO2. 4,600 times its weight in CO2. This is the CO2 primarily from the energy to run lights, AC, dehumid, curing, everything else, and some transportation. So there aren't many products that emit on upwards of 5,000 times their own weight in CO2. And so this is what kind of got this conversation started. This is a beautiful piece of work that came out from Summers et al. Just last month from the University of Colorado. And they took this to another whole level and modeled cannabis carbon footprint for the whole country, looking at key drivers of how clean or dirty is the grid, and then what is the weather, and what are the choices for heating and the need for heating in the winter. When lights are off, of course it's 12 or 18. The rest of the time, if it's 40 below outside or 120 above, you got to heat and air condition. And so this was really fascinating. And they came, you see Illinois is like ground zero. That's a combination of cold winter, but also that the grid is just incredibly dirty there. Lots of coal in the making of electricity. It was gratifying that this range that they came up with, 2,200 to 5,200 times its weight in CO2, did bracket the numbers that I developed with a much more simple method, a decade ago. And also, don't be deceived by the nice light yellow in Western Washington. You guys in the East are a little more trouble, but California is very light. But that's still over 2,000 times its weight in CO2. So this is a real problem everywhere. Jeremy started to mention some of these equivalencies. It's very important. The numbers I just gave you, they're very abstract, right? So here's a few of these kind of equivalencies. One number that I just figured out recently is that on a pound for pound or weight for weight basis, producing a gram of cannabis indoors uses 400 times as much energy. I think the number is actually 500. I think that's a typo there. Say 500 times it's as much energy as smelting aluminum. So that process you see there of making those aluminum ingots per unit weight, I mean, obviously one of those bricks there weighs multiple kilos, but on a per unit basis, it gives you a different kind of feeling of how energy intensive this process is. As Jeremy mentioned, a joint is like driving many, many miles in an efficient car. This also varies depending on where you are, and especially if you've got an electric car, it depends how clean the grid is. Nationally, those numbers were in 2012 when the last piece came out, equal to 3 million cars of CO2. So I estimate at the time that there's about 15 million tons of CO2 emissions for indoor cannabis cultivation in this country. That's the same as the emissions of about 3 million cars. Bringing it down more to a consumer level, because that conversation is really critical. The car example is an individual consumer perspective. Another number, the little pie chart down below the car, if you look at Colorado, which is the highest per capita average consumption state, and not the best grid, if you look at the carbon footprint of the average individual cannabis consumer in Colorado, their footprint from their consumption equals 60% of their home's carbon footprint for everything else, refrigerators, lighting, clothes washing, remarkably significant. For the state of Colorado, the authors of the Summers paper made the calculation that there's more CO2 emitted from cannabis cultivation than there is from the state's coal industry. Now, the state's coal industry, it's not the largest state in the union for coal, but they have a serious coal production industry in Colorado. So that's pretty astounding. So there are a lot of ways to slice and dice the data, but it's very important to bring these abstract numbers down to some terms that people can understand. Here's another one, just how much energy does a cannabis facility use per square foot per year compared to other facilities that are more familiar? And you can see homes and regular commercial buildings, the first two little blue bars there. So those are like 50 and 100 times less energy per square foot than indoor cannabis grow is using. And there you see other types of commercial buildings there that of course vary. The most energy intensive of them are restaurants, aka food service, and they're still using, a 20th or a 10th as much as indoor cannabis. So one thing that comes out of this picture is that we can't just kind of get out of this mess with energy efficiency. I'm an energy efficiency guy. That's my home field, energy efficiency in buildings. And normally we can do a lot, and we can bring buildings to what we call today net zero energy use, meaning all the energy needed in the building can be produced on site with typically solar electric panels. That is often possible and being done today, but you can't do that when you have this much energy intensity, and we'll explain why in a minute. So you need to first, if you're going to go to net zero, you need to bring energy demand down, and then you start investing in solar. But with this red bar here, you just can't bring that low enough with energy efficiency without going outdoors to be able to do solar. And here's what makes that point. So this is in the upper inset in the right is that 55-acre enclosed indoor grow industrial park, cannabis industrial park proposed for Blythe, California. It's not been built yet as far as I know, but they're looking for investors, have done all the design, they have their prospectus. The map, the Google view is Blythe. It's right there at the Colorado River on the right of the yellow square, and Arizona border is there. Agricultural area, because they're pulling a lot of water out of the Colorado. That grow, which is 2.4 million square feet, would represent that black square that you see, and that's actually exactly where the property is. The yellow around the black square is the area of solar panels that would be required, according to my numbers of the original paper, to zero out that carbon footprint. Now, people can and should debate, well, how much energy do we really need? Can we lower this? Are those numbers too low because now the industry is a lot more clever and efficient? Those are all conversations we can have, but take a look at this and how impossible this is to do. And among other things, I've made the orange shading somewhat translucent. You can see the farmland that would be displaced. So one thing that comes out of this is that from a land use perspective, normally one of the arguments that the indoor industry will use is that, well, we use less land per pound or per unit weight produced because we get our 5, 6, 7 harvests in a year and we're more intensive. Not if you really count, if you're going to be sustainable and offset with solar, even if that solar is somewhere else, which we'll get to in a second, that's way more land than you need to grow the same amount outside with the advanced methods that Jeremy was talking about. So this is really important. I had a professional industrial solar designer run these numbers for me, and in this case, it was 25 times the roof area. 25 times the roof area. And if you're a greenhouse, then it's 26 times the roof area because you can't put solar panels on the top of a greenhouse. So this is kind of some of the inconvenient truth of all this. So then the next question that's asked was, well, let's just clean up the grid and we can do the solar panels somewhere else, or wind farms. And so it's a fair question. I got curious about this. Many of you have heard of Coachella Valley in the California desert that's become a major indoor growing mecca, mostly due to very favorable regulation that's been set or not set there. And I got very curious. This is also an area that is one of the largest epicenters of wind energy in California. And they have about 2,300 wind turbines. These are big wind turbines. These are like 100-foot tall, towers. The second chart there, the second photo, those blue shadings are where all the wind farms are. Palm Springs is in kind of the lower right-hand corner of that picture. So major wind epicenter. I think it's about 10% of all California's wind power, and California is a leading state. So I started to do the math on this. And it was pretty stunning. Looking at these shaded squares on the right, they're all kind of to scale. The dark orange is the energy used by all the cannabis indoor cultivation that's been built so far in these cities: Cathedral City, Desert Hot Springs, Indian Wells, Rancho Mirage, and so on. The dotted green line with the green star, that's the wind energy produced today in Coachella Valley. And the other green dotted line way up near the top is the wind energy produced in all of California. The black line between those two is the electricity, the electricity would be used if all the entitlements that have been improved for Coachella Valley were built out. And so what you see is that if Coachella Valley just finishes what it started, it'll be using basically 7 times as much energy as all the wind turbines in that area, and almost as much energy as the entire state of California. So, or actually, I'm sorry, at build out, I'm sorry, this middle square is what's in development or proposed. All the entitlements are the outermost box. So if they build out all the entitlements, more energy needed than all the wind power in California. This is not sustainable. We can't afford, it took decades to build up all this wind power, right? We can't afford to all of a sudden reroute all of this to this industry that wasn't even on anybody's mind when wind development started, in the 1980s. So cleaning up the grid isn't enough either. So what we're left with is we can't fix this with efficiency. We can't fix this with renewables either. We're optimizing the suboptimal, is the term I like to use, or putting lipstick on a pig. So that's kind of the story, and just a couple more slides. The one thing to leave you with, which is kind of difficult, is that, but also a worthwhile challenge, and one that I know you all are up to, is that if you we're just talking about cultivation so far, right? But there's a broader energy life cycle and footprint of the whole process, the whole value chain. And so these are things that are potentially common to both indoor and outdoor cultivation. And they need to be looked at, just like, nobody's singling out cannabis. We need to look how we produce food. We need to look how we produce cars. We need to look how we design our houses, how we make potato chips. Everything's got to be looked at. There should be no double standard, no free ride. We can't solve it with doing one thing. We have to look at all the uses of energy. So these will all be familiar to you, but there's transportation, moving around equipment, moving around people, moving around final product. There's all the inputs. Again, these don't have to be carbon users, but if you have soil made at a distance or using artificial grow media, which isn't typical, I'm sure, for your community, although perhaps rock wool cubes are used to start the babies. I don't know. Those are made with melted rock, and it adds about 10% to the indoor grow carbon footprint if you count the rock wool for internal grows. What are the fertilizers? It's a lot of organic fertilizers that still use energy. You've hopefully read Michael Pollan's book, Omnivore's Dilemma, which goes into some of that. And then there's curing and preserving. And one of your members, whose names I won't disclose, just told me he put in a giant refrigerated container, on his beautiful sustainable outdoor site. And, it's an issue. And like we've heard, we need it available all year round and so on. But there's energy there. Now, the good news is that we can carbon neutralize loads like that on site. You can have enough PV panels to zero out a freezer. You just can't zero out a whole indoor grow. Anyway, then there's the retail. And then the big picture there is the extracts and preparations. That's a distillery for CBDs, is my understanding. And I don't know how much energy they use. Nobody's ever looked at that or written about it. I mean, the owners have a power bill, but I've never seen, this is one of the frontiers that needs to be looked at. That's obviously a very energy intensive process if you look at it. Sorry, one more thing is water. I just want to step away from energy for a second and talk about water. One of the big arguments also given for indoor being superior to outdoor is also bogus. You guys win, because to make electricity takes a lot of water, especially, ironically, hydroelectric electricity, because there's enormous evaporation. But also those cooling towers you see on the left, that's not smoke coming out of a power plant. That's the cooling, the evaporative cooling of the power plant water after the turbines have been run. And so my calculations are that it takes between 20 and 40 gallons a day per plant to cultivate indoors if, it's only a gallon or whatever direct irrigation. But if you look at all this water footprint, it's way more than outdoor cultivation. So you win again, but these are things that like Jeremy said, the consumers are just uneducated, and the regulators are uneducated about. So last slide is just what to do, what's needed, some things for you as individuals, for your organization. Back to the beginning, be proud of what you're doing. You have a lot of bragging rights. You're avoiding most of these emissions that we talked about without even trying. I mean, of course you're trying, but you're cultivating outside for all kinds of reasons, and you have this giant benefit that you're not really given credit for. But also be sustainable, of course, because sustainability isn't just using less energy. It's all your additives, your solid waste, the water. So growing outside in itself isn't a pass. And of course, outdoor growing has had much more bad PR than indoor has because of irresponsible cultivation. So be proud, be sustainable. I think the big tagline is transparency. It's just, again, this information isn't out there enough. The decision makers, the consumers don't have it. And so education and engagement, consumers obviously need to know. There's huge value for market pull, for people voting with their wallets, especially if you can't get regulators off the dime, or there's conflicts of interest, or information being suppressed. Educate the consumers. People are more and more voting with their consumption habits, but they can't unless they know, and they don't know. I mean, what would you think? 1 in 1,000 cannabis consumers or less probably really understands what we're talking about today. And then there's the bud tenders who, again, I think Jeremy said, are really not literate and not competent to explain to their customers, and instead they steer consumption towards the high carbon product. Investors is another one. Something I want to do now is really analyze the business models and look at, what is the bottom line for in versus out, especially tomorrow. If there is sustainability, how does that change the bottom line if you have all that solar, right? If you're recovering water, if you're doing all these things right, if you're buying LEDs, a lot of pushback against LEDs by indoor growers. They're very expensive. And what's the ROI on that? So I think the investment business case needs to be made better as cannabis companies, indoor cannabis companies, start to come into green funds and socially responsible funds. Those fund managers who are picking those stocks, they need to be educated that this is not necessarily something that they want in their portfolios. And then environmental organizations, you've probably noticed how quiet they are in this. Who has ever seen Greenpeace or the World Wildlife Fund or the Natural Resources Defense Council talk about this issue? Nature Conservancy has begun a bit. They have a really good program manager there who started to fund and be a participant as a scientist herself in analyzing both indoor and outdoor environmental impacts. And last but not least are politicians, and this is the last slide. What to do? They are largely uninformed, but also the lobby, of course, I don't need to tell you, for indoor producers is much stronger than the, much more well-resourced, I shouldn't say stronger, but more well-resourced than an organization like yours can be. And, I think a lot of the regulators are captive by this, either consciously or subconsciously, and even organizations who are promoting green cannabis indoors or outdoors are also not necessarily truly neutral or giving the full story, to their constituencies. So meanwhile, we have now a new president who is putting climate change front and center, and he's also probably going to be putting cannabis legalization front and center, and that is an enormous train wreck that I don't think they're aware of. That's an impending train wreck that they're not aware of. And so I think that message to Washington that you can't just do one of these without looking at the other. Now, fortunately, it's not a real choice between cannabis legalization and climate, but because outdoor cultivation can be done with quality and sustainability, but that's not going to happen by itself. And there are certain levers that the feds can consciously pull as they move forward on both those fronts, but they've got to do it. They've got to be deliberate about it. And so I think that's the last but not least, challenge that we all have in front of us. So that's my remarks. I'm at 23 minutes, a little over. Sorry, Crystal, but
you're
covered it. And happy to take any questions or tomatoes or whatever folks have to offer back my direction. Thanks for listening. And Crystal's got the slides, and you're welcome to share them around with people.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Mills. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to post those in the chat box on Zoom or in the comments section on Facebook. It does look like we have a question here on Zoom from Jade with Puffin Farms. And so her question was, have you spoken to any regulators or politicians that have taken an interest in this issue? Do you think there is any hope to deal with this issue via policy as national legalization rolls out?
Thanks, Jade. I have a bit, I've had inquiries, and then you never know who reads, what you write. But nothing highly promising. There's interest, but they're very harried. They have a lot of different people talking in their ear about this. So one person can't do all the education. You and others really need to get out there. I do think there's hope, but unfortunately, there are things like, and I'm very unpopular in this regard among my own peers, but typically energy policy and sustainable energy policy is about things like rebates for more efficient behavior technology, or it's about standards, codes and standards for buildings. And when your only tool is a hammer, and you see all your problems as nails, that's kind of the situation we have here, that they're looking at energy efficient building codes and rebates for things like LED lighting. And I find those actually not only counterproductive, but bordering on immoral and unethical, because they actually hurt your industry, right? They're subsidies to indoor producers that are not kind of counterbalanced with subsidies to outdoor production. So they make rebates in particular, obviously, make it more cost effective to grow indoors, and that biases the playing field. So there's efforts to work with policy. I mean, a lot of states are working with these kind of things I'm mentioning. A lot of utilities are looking at rebates, but I think they're misunderstanding the market dynamics. They're used to things that can't be done outside, right? You have a hospital. You want to make energy efficient hospital. You don't take all the patients out into the parking lot and turn off the air conditioning. You improve the building. But this is just so different. I can see one from Andrew. Do you want me to look at that?
Yeah, actually, we have one that came in through Facebook first, so let's go with that one from Dave Whiteside. And so his question is, are Washington cannabis farmers incentivized by tax breaks or so forth to use outdoor sustainable green growing methods? And I can say in Washington they aren't, but Evan, what do you think that would look like if we were to incentivize outdoor production?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And of course, you and your members can speak better. I don't know that we have 50 different policy landscapes. That's part of the problem, this patchwork. And so what's happening, just a footnote, in answer to that question, many are disincentivized. Illinois forbids outdoor production, full stop. It's against the law to grow outside. In California, about half the counties forbid outdoor cultivation. So there are actually disincentives more than there are incentives. I think, one of the things is the interstate transportation laws, obviously. Why should we be growing cannabis in Fargo, North Dakota in the middle of the winter? Well, because Fargo customers can only consume cannabis grown by North Dakota growers. So that's obviously a federal policy issue. Doubling down on the black market and other things that cause an oversupply and push down the prices of your product, more so, I'm told, than they push down the price of indoor. So that, again, makes you less profitable, but it's an artificial, it's something that the policymakers can help remedy. There's this thing, for those of you who are old enough, called the carbon tax, and that's always been this incredibly unpopular thing, but maybe that'll come back, or some other form of that. We don't charge for energy in commensurate way with its impacts on public health, on air quality, on ecosystems, on natural disasters. And so the price of energy and the subsidies for energy. Now, Biden administration is looking at eliminating subsidies on fossil fuels, which is a very potent and very important thing to do. And that will trickle down to the cannabis industry, actually. And then, there's a whole dynamic between states' rights or states' jurisdiction and federal, and I don't pretend to understand that here, but there's certain things that the states can't, that the feds can't do, or they have to defer to the states. But the feds can still, we've been down this road before, the feds can still develop model standards, model policies, model programs, and make them easy to adopt, by states, and cooperate with that. And I think one of the other last things is disclosure, just back to this slide. Like, there needs to be more transparency. And there's a lot of work that's been done with energy use disclosure requirements, usually not at the federal level, more at the state level. But again, that's a policy pathway to just make all this more visible. So I hope that's responsive a bit to the question.
Okay, and I guess let's go with Andrew's question here. What's the best statistic to share about indoor cannabis that helps illustrate how much power is consumed by indoor in contrast to sun-grown?
Well, I think there's no one best metric because there's all these different audiences, right? There's these different entities that you see on this slide, and so I think the messaging really needs to be tailored to who's being communicated to. The ones that are in my earlier slide, which again, Crystal, you can send around, are are top ones to use. If you pull up the 2012 paper, there's a bunch more equating it to how many houses and cross-country road trips and things like that. But it really just depends who your audience is.
Okay, and then I have a question on Facebook from Mark Ambler. What do you think about the potential for a demand response program with indoor and grid operators?
Well, they can and should be done, but again, that's lipstick on a pig to me. It's just, you've got this problem, and we have, it sounds like the person who asked the question is conversant about that whole issue. This is about the time of day that energy is used as opposed to the absolute amount. And some measures reduce the absolute amount and shift it around. But that's just barking up the wrong tree for this. We need to get it outside. We have enough demand that needs to be moved around already without creating yet more demand. And this is a particularly kind of difficult sector to do it with because you can't interrupt those 12 hours. You can't interrupt those 18 hours without you're hurting the crop. And so, there are things that can be done, but it's kind of a red herring here. Demand response is not the solution.
All right, and that looks like that's all we have for questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Mills. So
My pleasure.
Have you.
Okay, so it was great to hear from Dr. Evan Mills there, and I have to tell you, Dig, it was a real privilege to have him on the show, and I was at that Sun Growers Association Cannabis Cup presentation. It was great to hear him because for me it was kind of an honor. It was one of my first interviews back when I first started writing cannabis. I came across his Cannabis Climate Report from 2010, and I emailed him and asked him to answer a couple questions, and he emailed me back and interviewed him and wrote one of my first cannabis articles on outdoor cannabis growing and the benefits and the sort of the pitfalls of growing indoors. And so great to have him on. Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that was Crystal Oliver there of the Washington State Sun Growers Association, and she's the director of that organization, and really want to thank her for everything she does in cannabis in the state too. So I know you really like outdoor growing, Uncle Dig.
I love outdoor growing. I believe I'm in a good place for it, right? I'm on the northern edge of what some people consider the Emerald Triangle down in Southern Oregon. I think that if you have a climate for it, or even if you don't, if you can get it done, growing outdoors is one of the most satisfying ways to grow cannabis, in my opinion. Now, other people may disagree with me, and that's fine.
Yeah, I love it too. I grew my first cannabis plant in Alabama way back, and I didn't have any idea what was going to happen when I grew it, and I totally messed it up, and I did get some out of it. We tried to smoke it right off the vine.
Oh boy.
It didn't work. But it was just kind of fascinating to see that happen, and it is if you're somebody that's really into plants, it is a fascinating plant how it grows. And we talk about that a lot on the show. So it was great to have Dr. Mills on here. But now we're going to get into our final segment of the show, and that is our It's a Bust segment. And this segment comes to us out of Texas, which is a very hardcore prohibition state, which is crazy because it's right there on the border, which Mexico is about to have legal adult use cannabis. They have medical cannabis, and lots of cannabis come across that border. But in Texas, there's two men were pulled over for going too slow in the passing lane, and they were found on I-30, and they were found to have a fairly large amount of cannabis oil and some gummies and some cannabis flower.
Yep. Yeah, and it's in those states, Texas being one of the big ones, we would just caution people to be very careful traveling with any amount of cannabis, because the cops know that legalization may be on its way, but they don't care. It's an excuse to get revenue and lock people up, and that's what the cops are there for.
Yeah, and to be clear, if they were found with that same amount of oil here, they still would have got in some trouble too. So that's that's something to point out too. It was like what was it, like 73 grams of oil?
73 grams of oil, and I think they had they're saying 57 grams of edibles, and I would say that's close to I don't know exact, probably like a fair amount of edibles, like a pretty good sandwich bag. And then it looks like they had about a quarter ounce of weed as well.
Yeah, so it's too bad that they got busted down there. Hopefully legalization will open up a little more. And Dig and I are advocates for legalization to be open all the way. And I don't know about you, Dig, but if, for me, in my perfect world, if they were found with 73 grams of oil, just the question would be like, it wouldn't even be a lot of question, just would you like to come work for us producing oil? So we don't want to throw people in jail for having these substances. I guess that's what's my main point. The actual solution to it, it's really hard to come up with, but we want to get away from police, guns, jails, courts, all this stuff.
Yeah, we want to get away from coercive power structures violently detaining people for mild drug infractions and cultivating plants. That's not the system we want to continue.
Exactly. And so thank you so much for doing the show today, Dig. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can send an email to info@radiotacoma.org and put the subject, the Cannabis Corner, and they will get that information to me. And how can folks get in touch with you, Dig? And be sure to include your podcast in there, Dig.
All right, yeah, you can listen to my podcast. It's called The Bagseed Chronicles with Uncle Dig. You can find that on Apple Podcasts or any of your other podcatchers. You can follow me on Instagram to see what I'm doing in the garden at Uncle Dig, and you can send me an email if you have questions for me or for my other show at uncledig4@gmail.com.
This is Cannabis Corner, hosted by Lucas Barfield. If you would like to get in contact with your host, he is on Twitter at MJIsMedicine. Your musical selection is The Happy Monster by Chubby Jackson and his orchestra, recorded on 78 in 1947. You can find this music and much more at the Great 78 Project, an archive of historical music recordings at great78.archive.org. You are listening to 101.9 KTAH, Radio Tacoma.